Good day, class. Welcome to our introduction to our lesson on consumption and consumerism. So let us first look at the nature of the problem. So for many decades, the overconsumption patterns of the developed as well as our developing countries have led to the detriment of the environment and human health. Now, this overconsumption, as we would see in upcoming slides, is firstly directly connected to our expanding human population, our growing human population. And we already know that where human populations grow, or even exist for that matter, human beings, for survival, even basic survival, we have to consume natural resources. We have to consume natural resources for food, for shelter, for clothing. And once there is consumption of those natural resources, even for our most basic needs, we know that there will be waste associated with that. But let us now factor in that exponential growth of our human population over the last 300 years or so. As that population begins to increase, remember, our natural resources are finite while human populations have been growing. So we therefore now have an imbalance in terms of the amount of resources being consumed at a faster rate than the natural resources can replenish themselves. This is what now brings us into that problem of overconsumption. And then, of course, when we also consider the issue of the consumption patterns that are also directly related to industrialization and affluence of societies, we also note that there are particular consumption patterns you would observe that are associated with affluence. For example, rich countries as opposed to poor countries. That affluence and those consumption patterns that we are referring to, we can now directly relate back to what we refer to as the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, that's around our 1700s, early and mid 1700s, that's what we refer to as the 18th century. So this period marks the beginning of a period of tremendous economic growth. For some countries, particularly, you found that that period of time, the Industrial Revolution, it began in Britain with the development of steam energy, and it expanded to other parts of Europe and the United States of America. So during this period, you found that there was tremendous economic growth, and you found that many of those countries where industrialization and mechanization was growing, you found that they were now moving away from agrarian, or in other words, agricultural societies, to more industrial and urban centers. So here now, associated with industrial revolution, we have urbanization taking place. Now, what we found, what researchers found, is that in the long term, however, remember I indicated that you have, with increasing consumption, you're going to have increased waste. And now industrialization and mechanization now added a different element to the waste that is being produced. This waste now is, we now have chemical wastes that are being released into our environment. Chemical waste and other types of hazardous waste that was not present before, where prior to that period, you find the waste would have been more natural and organic in nature, that would allow it to at least be recycled through the natural environmental processes. But now industrialization now added a different element to the problem. So now we have increased air pollution, increased land and water pollution, and all the consequences that come along with it. So here we have a snapshot of the situation. We're going to look at it in just a bit more detail. So this is really just a summary slide, but we have some very significant and important points here. So what I want to do is I want to start with the population and development, because as mentioned in the previous slide, the problem really was very evident. The beginning of the problem really was very evident with that exponential growth we had in population that seemed to have happened around the time, or began around the time, of the Industrial Revolution. So what we, as mentioned before, what we had is a lot of rural urban migration now taking place. So what we find now is small farming, because many parts of the world it was quite normal for the most significant part of your economy and population to be in agricultural areas. But now that started shifting with the growing population that was associated with that time period of the Industrial Revolution. So we have growing urbanization. We find that small, as I said, small farming and agriculture now started being sacrificed in favor of mechanization and urbanization. Associated with this, we find there is increased consumption, as I mentioned, with your growing population and consumption of your natural resources to meet at least basic needs. Additionally, we find increased wastage, which is production of waste, which directly leads to pollution of our environment. And that pollution was not only in our natural environment, but you find high levels of pollution in urban environments as well. This leads to environmental degradation that can lead to further poverty. What we found happening in the earlier days of urbanization and industrialization is that those urban environments, you find the waste buildup there, and the public health crisis that evolved from all of that was actually pretty tremendous in those days. People would be disposing of their waste out into the streets. There was no proper public health and sanitation programs in place. But of course, as science and knowledge started to increase during that period as well, along with the increase in industrialization, you found that improvements in sanitation started to take place. So now all of these issues, all of these phenomena would now contribute to a greater health well-being of the people. So you found that eventually prosperity and well-being started to come out of that. So you found industrial societies started actually benefiting more in that way. Um, but coming out of all of these problems that seem to be associated with increased in consumption and growing populations is that it became obvious that there was a greater need for good governance and good decision making in order to better facilitate the resource allocation that we have. Remember, I mentioned our resources are pretty much finite, right? Our water, our land, um, the air that we breathe, it doesn't change. The quantities of it doesn't change, but the quality can be degenerated and degraded because of human activities. So therefore, it now becomes very important for those in authority to provide good, wise decision making in order for us to better steward and manage the resources that we have. So let us look at that poverty that we were talking about in the previous block here. Poverty that can come out of a degraded environment. Now, how do we know that poverty exists? There are indicators that we could look at. So these indicators are usually measurable phenomena or characteristics about different aspects of poverty that would allow us to, as we measure it, we can now make decisions hopefully better decisions in order to reduce and eliminate. So what are some of the poverty indicators? We have reduced life expectancy. So poverty would often be associated with increased morbidity and sickness. That increased sickness often leads to a reduction in lifespan. If you look at global figures on poverty and even in terms of life expectancy, you would find that oftentimes you find that poorer countries or poorer regions tend to have lower life expectancy than richer countries. Other indicators, you can look at reducing national gross domestic product, that is GDP of countries. So the poorer countries would have smaller and declining GDP. That GDP is a reflection of economic prosperity. That is also associated with poverty. You have an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Um, this is particularly characteristic of poor countries and poor regions. Richer countries, you tend to find you have a larger middle class, whereas poorer countries, you don't really find a larger middle class, and the majority of your population tends to be in that poor group. We have poverty is also associated with unemployment, where persons are not able to engage in productive activities in order to feed themselves, to have access to healthcare and all of the important things associated with it. Poverty is also associated with illiteracy. Um, Again, when you look at global figures, you will find that poor countries and poor regions tend to have higher levels of illiteracy. Gender inequality also is another indicator of poverty. Um, Again, poorer areas, you find that women tend to be poorer. They often don't have opportunities to earn a living, to help their families. They tend to be sicker. In many countries, we find that um, they will get less food than the males in the society. All right, so you have inequality as an indicator of poverty. And also, poverty is also associated with limited access to social and healthcare services. So, not only in terms of the limited number of social and healthcare services. So social might include things like schools and entertainment and all of these things. And then of course healthcare services, not only in terms of the number of them, but oftentimes access to it. For example, here in Trinidad, we are very fortunate that there's free healthcare available to us. So in many parts of the world, that is not so. Healthcare is not free, which puts it out of the hands and the access of poor populations. So here in Trinidad, we actually need, even though we may not have the best, but we have to be very grateful for what we have. So now that we've talked a lot about poverty that is associated with increased consumption and degradation of our environment, it takes us now into poverty eradication. What are some of the things that need to be addressed, that authorities and governments need to address in order to reduce or eradicate poverty? These are some of the things that you would find in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Um, so education needs to be a major focus of our decision makers, making education affordable and accessible to all. Education helps provide the skills and the knowledge that people need in order to not just simply go out and get a job that someone else has provided for you, but education also helps individuals come up to that cognitive level that helps you become, helps you develop your creativity and your problem solving skills, so that you can even become your own entrepreneur, start your own business, maybe employ other people. Poverty eradication can also be achieved by providing better sanitation and drinking water. So that proper sanitation would be things like proper and regular solid waste management systems in place, um, having proper drinking water access, not only in terms of the volume of water available to you, but also the quality of the water. Because when we're talking about drinking water, not the water that you would find just any and everywhere would be suitable for drinking. So that means that you have to have proper um, water systems in place, water treatment systems, water distribution systems in place in order to, and access for everyone, to eradicate poverty. Because remember that water, also access to proper drinking water would also affect health. All right, so your health is associated with cleanliness, um, uh, and proper health. Food security. Food security is very important. More and more, the world that we live in today, we are beginning to see how important food is and how important it is for every nation to actually be food producers rather than importers, because we live in a global society now where many countries, including countries like ours, particularly richer countries, have gotten dependent on the importation of food. What happens now, if things happen in the world as are happening now with the coronavirus in 2020, where food production in the various places that you would import from, food production is reduced. There is now less for you to import. All right. So food production and food security is very important. You want to make sure that you have sufficient quantities of food, that the food is affordable, and that it is available to everyone. Because again, this access to good quality and adequate food is important for good health. Good health is important in order to receive a good education, and good health is important in order for you to work and be productive. Better housing is also another method of poverty eradication. What would better housing look like? Better housing is not necessarily a grand housing facilities and must be 3 bedroom and garage and no. When we talk about better housing, we are looking at issues that would, do you have indoor plumbing? Do you have indoor toilet facilities? Or if not indoor toilet facilities, is there some kind of um, decent latrine service available somewhere nearby, so that we don't have situations like occurs in some parts of the world where poverty is so great that people are defecating in the open and in water courses. All right. Do you have electrical um, facilities and power in your home to facilitate and power things like refrigeration? So all of these things are very important. Is housing affordable? All of these things that you would have to look at. And then of course better infrastructure, how so that some of the things I talked about relating to housing, better infrastructure would be included there, where I talked about access to proper water, um, good clean water supplies, particularly if you have access to it in your home, the electricity. Um, then you also talking about infrastructure would include things like proper drainage, not only in and around your home, but in your community, so that wastewater and these different things can be transported elsewhere. That infrastructure would also include things like the treatment facilities, waste treatment facilities that are part of the entire infrastructure in your community, etc. All right, so that waste doesn't build up in your community to affect your environment. And as the environment is affected, by waste, of course, our health is affected. So we move from these strategies of poverty eradication now to a more holistic view to look at the issue of sustainable development. So when we talk about sustainable development is directly related to the problem that we identified at the beginning of the lesson, which is the fact that we have been consuming our natural resources at a rate that it cannot be replenished, and therefore we have to be concerned that these finite resources, um, what are we leaving for the future generations to come? Are we consuming it at a rate where there will be little or nothing left for future generations? We cannot do that. We cannot live our lives with such myopic view that we forget that the resources that we use, future generations will also be dependent on it. So our mindsets need to be changed. All right, so this is really what sustainable development is all about. So sustainable development, how can we achieve that? We can look at improved agricultural development. And when we talk about improved agricultural development, we mean, for example, making adjustments to the way we do things. For example, we use traditionally agriculture, we use a lot of chemicals and a lot of pesticides in our agriculture that actually, um, which are intended really to protect the crops, but then at the same time you have a negative outfall in that the chemicals can now enter your soils, it enters the food, and when it enters the food, of course you have a feedback to human beings and our our health and well-being. All right, so we have to identify um, sustainable and clean strategies for growing food, but also growing that food in quantities that are sufficient for our growing populations. So, and little later on in the lesson, you would read and learn about the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, that period of time in the mid 20th century, the 1950s, around there, I believe it was, science actually developed strategies such as, the various genetically modified seeds and plants and the chemicals to protect the crops from pests and diseases, etc. Those were all intended to increase yield and increase quantity of food. However, many decades later, we see that there have been serious environmental consequences coming out of that. All right, so we have to find new ways um, to carry out and conduct agriculture. Um, we also have to identify increased energy efficiency. So we use a lot of energy in industry. We use energy um, in our homes for heating and cooking. Energy and agriculture uses a significant amount of whether it's water power, electricity, whatever the case may be, in order to facilitate their operations. And as we use this energy, um, much of it tends to be from fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels are examples of non-renewable energy sources, such as your coal and petroleum and oil, etc. And when we use this, it does not replenish itself. All right, hence we call it non-renewable. Okay, but they also release pollutants into our environment. Some of those pollutants from petroleum would be, the various carbon emissions. Um, Industry, not only from manufacturing, but industry often requires a tremendous amount of transportation. So vehicles burn a lot of fuel, and we have a lot of vehicle emissions into our atmosphere, polluting our air, contributing to acid rain and all of these things. Okay, so, and we have to find energy efficient ways to carry out our activities. For example, that can be done in the form of identifying new sources of energy, first of all, such as renewable sources of energy, solar power, wind power, um, hydroelectric power. So those are examples of non renewable sources of energy. But we also want to become, each and every one of us, more energy usage conscious. Don't leave your air condition running all day, especially if you're not in the room. Don't leave your lights on all day. Turn off the lights in rooms that you are not present. So we have to be more conscious of how we use energy. So we have to conserve energy as well. And additionally, as part of sustainable development behavior, um, certainly at higher levels, such as government levels, we want to be able to protect the biodiversity, our ecosystems, because with a lot of the activities we carry out, such as agriculture, we need a lot of land. What happens is we tend to clear those lands for agriculture, destroying habitats. When we destroy and interrupt ecosystems and habitats, we endanger species. And there's, again, when you have a disruption in any ecosystem, it will have a feedback consequence to us as human beings. So what are some of the things we can do to protect biodiversity? We can increase funding towards the research of the threat, the problem. Um, Education, we can educate people at all levels as to the importance of protecting that biodiversity. And then, of course, we have international agreements where countries can sign on to have policies and laws put in place where we can protect some of these sensitive areas. For example, we talked in one of our earlier lessons about the Ramsar site in Trinidad and Tobago. That's for the protection of one of our valued wetlands. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at this issue of sustainable development. All right, so these are the three main pillars of sustainable development. Each circle represents a pillar. We have the environmental pillar, economic pillar, and social pillar. So for each of those, we see some of the issues that would be addressed and focused on in each pillar, so you can have an understanding of it. For example, focus on management of your natural resource use, environmental management. We look at pollution prevention. An economic pillar would be um, the generation of profits and cost savings, particularly on a national level. Focus would be on economic growth and also research and development that can contribute to all of that. On a social level, some of the area of focus would be looking at and trying to improve the national standard of living, or even in various communities, improvements in education and making education accessible to all, community development and improvement, and also equal opportunity, not only for women, but also minority groups. All right. Now, typically, what you would often find is that many countries will focus either on one or two pillars at the expense of the other pillar. So, for example, developing countries tend to focus a lot on economics and social development at the expense of the environment. And this is typical worldwide. Okay, so the ideal situation when we are looking at trying to manage our environment is you need to find an intersection of all three, and this is what we call sustainability. However, as I mentioned, priorities tend to vary for different countries, and so national priorities is often what drives policies towards sustainable development. So for example, those decisions for priorities have to happen at the highest levels of government. Government will therefore Once they've identified the national agenda, they would put laws in place, and those laws are what would actually force a certain type of behavior at various levels of their communities. All right. And then, of course, policies would be put in place in order to achieve the the goals and the objectives of the laws that have been put in place. Now, typically, developing countries tend to be focused more on social and economic development, as I mentioned, at the expense of the environment. Developed countries, on the other hand, you find that they are a bit further along that path to development, because remember, they started with the Industrial Revolution, right? That mechanization and industrialization back in the 1700s. Um, Other parts of the world came on more around the 20th century. So we find then that developed countries, they have already had the experience of environmental degradation and a lot of the effects that went with it. So you find now that those developed countries, their mindsets and focus have also been shifting to include that environmental pillar a bit more than some other parts of the world that have not yet reached that place. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson, and I encourage you, please refer to eClassroom for the activities for this week. Thank you.